Hi, welcome everybody. Looks like it's going to be a fun weekend with maybe even good weather for a change. Somehow or other, I was told that I was the moderator for this panel. It came to as some surprise to me, but I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to introduce probably the four smartest people in my class, and this is the class of '69, which was clearly the most outstanding class in the history of this venerable institution. I see a lot of agreement there. And very briefly, we have Dan Bickley. Dan, and you may have heard from various people that nowadays it's pretty common in this school anyway for people to get what's called the MD plus degree, where they get MDs, PhDs, MBAs, law degrees, et cetera. Dan was one of the first people I knew to get both an MD and a PhD, so he's a pioneer as far as that goes, and clearly the wave of the future way back 50 years ago. 50 years. You know, one of my patients once said, I thought getting old would take longer, so it's kind of hard to believe that we're here at our 50th reunion. Anyway, second is John Drainoff, who has been a pioneer in the development and the recognition of the need for multi-specialty group care and delivery of health care to large populations of patients. He's been a pioneer in that respect. Many of us remember him as the guy who moderated, produced, and directed our annual Follies production. And it's been a little surprising to me that I've not seen him as the host of the Oscars yet, but I hear they're looking for someone. Patty, you've already heard about. Patty is really world famous as someone who really revolutionized the whole healthcare system out in Denver and has gotten some spectacular recognition, well-deserved, for doing just that. And Bill, whose, I think, main accomplishment was putting up with me as a roommate for a couple of years, is a well-known, well-respected educator, has run a couple high-powered academic programs in radiology. He's been chair of a couple departments of radiology as well. And interestingly enough, Bill was actually born here at HUP. I don't know if there's anyone else here in this room who can say that. Oh, Dr. Gamble. Oh, there you go, three of you. All right, I'm impressed. At any rate, Joe, can I have, there's my first slide. Our first speaker, presenter is Dan Bickley. You can see his Hall of Fame credentials there. He is a professor of medicine and dermatology out there on the West Coast at UCSF. And his topic today is replete with terms that many of us don't even know what they mean. The new genetics, genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics, and their impact on modern medicine. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Dan, so please.
Thank you, Lou. So I think we're ready to go here. So I've changed the topic a little bit. Bottom line is added a few more omics here. But basically, we weren't even thinking about this stuff. We weren't even dreaming about this stuff when we graduated from medical school. So let's start with genomics, which really began the revolution. Just to give you a few of the basics, which most of you probably know something about, and that is the human genome. It's got about 20,000 genes, 3 billion bases, approximately. Sequencing one genome generates 100 gigabytes of raw data, and we're needing these huge computers to process all the data, as you will see, as we manipulate this massive amount of information that we're getting from modern sequencing. Now, the Human Genome Project, which sequenced one gene, was an international consortium beginning in the late 1990s. Final draft, what they call a final draft, completed in 2003, and it's estimated to cost somewhere between 0.5 and $1 billion. One genome. And the cost now, any of you who have gotten 23andMe know, that the cost is now approaching $1,000 per genome, but it's the analyzing and interpreting the data is where the big money is. So this is just a representation of what's happening over the last, in this case, less than 20 years since the genome was first, human genome was first sequenced. It was costing millions of dollars to sequence the genome in the beginning, in the mid-20s, 2000s rather. And that has fallen down, as I mentioned, to about $1,000 per genome. Meanwhile, the cost of analyzing this data has risen up into the millions of dollars, starting with a very small amount in terms of the money. And what you're seeing here, whoops, I got to do it on the screen. What you're seeing here is that's where the big bucks these days lies, is in the analysis, not in the sequencing itself. Okay. So what can we do with this new capability, new sequencing capability? First of all, a lot of effort has gone into cancer genome profiling. And what we have is this Cancer Genome Atlas, which, combined with the International Cancer Genome Consortium, has identified about 10 million cancer-related mutations in over 12,000 cancers, providing data about their genetic, epigenetic mechanisms, molecular markers, and druggable targets. And I will say what Larry Jameson was just talking about in terms of immunotherapy, a lot of that is based on how we use the kind of data that's coming out of all this sequencing information. We also have, we also have genome-wide association studies. These are GWAS studies. And basically here we're looking at sequences from thousands and thousands of people in which they're trying to identify these SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that correlate or associate with a given disease trait. Whole genome or whole exon sequencing, this is fairly starting to be pretty commonplace. When you have a disease, you're trying to figure out what causes it, what's the mutation. Well, whole genome or whole exon sequencing is being used for that, to identify the mutations, particularly in some of these rare diseases that you want to access the etiology about. Pharmacogenetics or genomics. We're using the sequencing information to identify people who have a different response to certain drug therapies. Very important in today's medicine. And then we have gene editing, and this is becoming very controversial. As many of you probably read in the papers, the Chinese investigator did some gene editing with using this CRISPR-Cas technology in order to modify some newborns. And that was considered a no-no, but I think we're going to see this becoming a yes in the not too distant future. Okay, so what is CRISPR-Cas? What is gene editing? So and why is it so relevant to the sequencing of the genome that we know about? Well, basically what we're doing is taking a nuclease, which is Cas9, and combining it with a guide RNA with a sequence that we know will direct that nuclease to the gene itself that you want to modify. And it's capable then, when it sits down on the DNA here, it cuts it. And you can then cut the DNA, take out that piece that is mutated that you want to change, and insert a normal or a wild type or whatever trait you want to insert into that DNA, and you're off and running. It's incredible. We're going to see this happening in the next few years clinically. It's certainly happening all over the place in research labs. Okay, now in addition to the DNA and the DNA sequencing business, we all have the same DNA in our cell, every cell, but our cells are different. How come? And this is because of epigenetic modifications in the way that DNA is being read and how it's being activated or regulated. Several aspects of this I want to identify here or talk to you about. DNA can be methylated. That's typically puts a stopper on the transcriptional process. Histones play a major role. Histones wrap up the DNA in sort of these nucleosomes. When they are modified by acetylation or methylation, they can either open up the DNA for reading or close it up, depending on what the epigenetic marker is. There are chromatin modelers, which are another set of proteins which regulate accessibility of the chromatin to transcriptional regulation. these epigenetic changes can be environmental. So there are environmental influences that change the way the DNA is being read through these epigenetic processes. In fact, it's estimated that I show you here that over 90% of human disease is due, in fact, to epigenetic modifications from various environmental factors, smoking, for example. Epigenetic changes can be transient, or in fact, they can be inherited. And this is a sort of a new thing, that obesity, for example, in the parents can, in fact, be transmitted into the children. Now, I want to talk a little bit about chromatin immunoprecipitation assays, because these permit investigators, and this will be increasingly used clinically, to determine where these epigenetic changes are taking place. And this is my one data slide, folks, but I couldn't resist, oh, not quite yet. This is just a model of the epigenetic changes. I did not make this slide. So don't bug me about my misspellings on this slide. But it does make the point, and that's really what I want, is that these methylations and acetylations and phosphorylations modify these histones and can open or close the chromatin, allowing accessibility. Okay, so so ChIP-seq is what I want to talk about now, is a process by which you cross-link these proteins, the histones, whatever, transcription factors that you're interested in. You cross-link this to the DNA. You then extract the DNA out. You cut it up. You sonicate it into sizable pieces, and then you sequence all this stuff. 50,000 reads. Think about that. 50,000 reads is kind of a typical sequencing event. And what you see, based on what's in the immunoprecipitate with your antibody against the factor that you're interested in, you see where these factors land on the DNA, and it's for the whole genome. So my one data slide, which I'm very proud about because it's mine, moving ahead, oh, it's blocked. There we go. It's a big slide, actually. So this is what a ChIP-seq will look like. For those of you who couldn't care less about science, you can go to sleep now. But we're interested in vitamin D and vitamin D regulation genes. And so the vitamin D receptor is the transcription factor that we're particularly interested in here. And what we see, now I'm taking a gene that I happen to know is regulated by vitamin D. It's CYP24. And CYP24, that gene is shown here with the exons and the introns. Don't need to worry about that. But what it shows is on the top line, this is where the vitamin D receptor lands, in these regions of this particular DNA. And we have other factors, a histone that opens up the DNA, enabling the transcription to take place. So in this case, H327 potassium. They don't mean potassium acetylation. And those marks are here, and they are right in place where the vitamin D receptor is landing, and that's exactly what you expect. If we take away 125D, the vitamin D active metabolite, this stuff goes back into noise. So that's what I really want to show you. And we can then, any gene, all 20,000 genes, I have the database for, and I can look at every one of those genes. Needless to say, I can do that in an easy afternoon, right? I can look at every gene to see which one of these genes are regulated by vitamin D and where. And this is very helpful in terms of designing what genes to approach if I want to start looking at where does vitamin D actually affect, what pathways. Okay, so moving right along, the next omic that we do alongside of ChIP-seq is transcriptomics. It's RNA-seq. So there, what we're looking at is the sequencing of all the transcripts that are turned on in the course of whatever manipulation we're doing. Drug manipulation, diseases that we're interested in. Why has this person got a disease, this person doesn't? So we're talking about a lot of RNA sequencing. This is 20,000, there's transcripts from 20,000 genes, but in fact, because of lots of alternative splicing and so forth, a lot more than that. But what you get in your analysis is these sort of maps or nodes of all the proteins that are translated from your transcriptomics. And you see nodes, these different nodes here, which are sort of the center of the action. And you can then approach those nodes and think about what pathways is my manipulation or my disease, what's affecting. And you have a way of approaching the diseases to see if you can modify these pathways. So it's a very powerful technique. So proteomics, very briefly, the major tools here are mass spec and cryo-EM. Cryo-EM is for the 3D structure. Mass spec is for identification. And you can take, say, sera of a diseased patients and normal patients, look at the sera, run mass spec, find out what are the differences in the protein profiles between the two. And that gives you some clues about what's going on in the disease. You can identify post-translational modifications of these proteins. Mass spec enables you to do that. And there are estimated to be about 10,000 such sites. And they could very well, changes in the post-translational modification, give you a clue what's going on with drugs or with diseases. Now, I mentioned already, cryo-EM is good for looking 3D structure to look at whether proteins are malfolded, which certainly takes place in a number of diseases, even some diseases that we learned about in medical school. And then you can determine what proteins talk to each other, what complexes are actually formed. So proteomics, very powerful. Okay, so now we're entering the new world of personalized medicine. We're hearing a lot about that. Larry already mentioned that we have tests predictive of genes such as BRCA1, BRCA2 for breast cancer, apoprotein E4 for Alzheimer's, HTT, Huntington's disease, on and on and on. Question is, when you sequence a person's genome for a given mutation, and you get some information that maybe you weren't expecting, and the question then for physicians is, do they reveal that to patients or not? Do you really want to know what else is in your genome? Maybe, maybe not. So we have tests to determine genetic differences or protein expression that impact the response of genes, such as determining cancer, therapy for breast cancer. If you express the HER2 express that, you have a different form of therapy in women who don't express that, and so forth. As some of you, I'm sure many of you are aware that there are fast metabolizers of coumadin and slow metabolizers, and that seems to relate to this gene, CYP2C9. If you have it, you're either fast or you're slow. We can determine that. That helps you adjust the starting dose. There are genes now which will test, and this is Dr. Jameson's territory. We have these thyroid nodules. You do the cytology of them. You don't know. Is it malignant? Is it not? So now we have tests that look at the miRNA levels in those genes and look for genes that predict malignancy of the gene. So that's very useful in combination with the thyroid biopsies. And then we have tests for these SNPs, these single nucleotide polymorphisms, to determine levels of risk for a variety of polygenic diseases, such as osteoporosis and diabetes. And all this is out there. All this is happening as we speak. All right, so basically we're going from these omics, which inform our approach to the patient, individual patients, as well as our approach to populations. And finally, summary, omics, the present and future of medicine, I say, didn't exist 50 years ago. We are really in a biologic revolution affecting medical research and its application to the practice of medicine. Formidable barriers, however, remain, including cost, determining when such testing is cost-effective, processing the massive amount of data generated by many of these new techniques, interpreting the results in a way that can be understood by the provider, as well as applied to the patient for effective patient care. And bottom line is that bioinformatics, genetic counseling are really emerging as new medical specialties. and their subject matter needs to be part of the curriculum. And I hope Dr. Jameson probably is happening here at Penn, but it should be part of the basic curriculum of our current physicians in terms of CME, as well as the physicians-to-be as they go through medical school. And I thank you.
At this point, I want to introduce my second classmate, John Drainoff, who is, as I said, a pioneer, a guy with a lot of forethought, who is the founder of a large multi-specialty group that eventually grew into the Mount Nittany Physicians Group, and of which he is now the CEO. So he knows a lot about delivery of health care to a lot of people, and maybe when he's done, we can nominate him for president. If he has
Excuse me, I'm sure my boss would like to know that I'm the CEO. Sometimes maybe she thinks that I am. It's a pleasure to be back here and to see so many faces that I recognize from years ago. And I think hopefully some of the things I'm going to say are going to shake a few trees and give you some nostalgia and what have you about where we came from and where we are now and how it's impacted patient care. If I can work this. Technology. My first slide used to be a dinosaur with a yellow eye, looking from the perspective of an old guy through a jaundiced eye. But coming back to my 50th reunion, I figured I wanted to look more like a tough guy. So I think in terms of patient care, we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Is he smoking, John?
He's smoking a cigar. But he's tough. He's made it to 90-some years old now. Anyway, just think back to where we were when we left medical school 50 years ago. Think about some of the illnesses. Now, the 50th year grads are honored to be at the Bellevue Stratford, the home of Legionnaire's disease. We didn't know about that 50 years ago. Okay? We didn't know about Lyme disease. We didn't know that ulcers could be caused by bacteria. Okay, now Helicobacter pylori is there. We had pseudomembranous enterocolitis, but we didn't know about Clostridium difficile. Okay, now there's a new fungus out there that's a challenge for us in Candida auris, and that's supposed to be killing all of us pretty soon unless we do something about it. But think about the other things we didn't know about. AIDS was not on the radar screen. It was essentially unknown. If you look at other things, hepatitis C, we didn't even talk about hepatitis A and B. We had infectious hepatitis and serum hepatitis. Now there's hepatitis A, B, C, D, et cetera. We didn't know about Ebola, Marburg, some of the other things, SARS that have affected us, the West Nile virus. We didn't know about prions. You know, prions are little folds of protein that can cause infectious disease in animals and probably in humans. This is Stanley Prusiner. He was a year ahead of us in medical school, and he received the Nobel Prize for describing prions. He got the Nobel Prize in 1997, I believe. So obviously, you'd be surprised that somebody from our medical school made such an achievement in microbiology. We had the Penn Med Tabernacle Choir when we were here, otherwise known as the Good Time Charlies. Who had a song, Bugs, 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 they're all the same to me. I got my micro training at the famous U of P. We don't have signs or we don't know signs or symptoms, I'm very sad to say, but we sure know our DNA, as Dan Bickley has just pointed out to us. Think about the new drugs that we have. Statins, as an example. Statins didn't exist then. Again, 3 years ahead of us was Mike Brown, who won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for his work in making us understand the role of of cholesterol in the genesis of atherosclerosis. So we were around some pretty prominent people. We didn't have diuretics as they're known today. You can recall when somebody would come into the ICU here with congestive heart failure, it was 2 cc's of thiamurin in the butt. Okay, nobody's ever heard of thiamurin if you talk to younger people. H2 blockers, proton pump inhibitors used for the treatment of gastric diseases. We didn't have them. The antibiotics have all changed. We didn't have quinolones. We didn't have we didn't have the macrolides that we have today. The cancer drugs are all changed. We didn't have monoclonal antibodies, et cetera. So, you know, I think there's been tremendous achievements in that. Look at surgery, for example. a picture from our day. If you ask a younger person who this is, they won't know, but that's the President of the United States showing off his big scar, okay? We don't do that anymore. Well, we try not to. And when I say we, I'm not a surgeon, so I can't be held responsible. But, you know, we do that through microscopic surgery, looking with fiber optics. You know, that's the way these things are done today. We do robotic surgery or robotically assisted surgery, endovascular surgery. We are replacing heart valves and repairing heart valves using catheters, not doing open heart surgery. Imaging, completely different. You may recall that we didn't have CT scans. We didn't have MRIs. We didn't have PET scans. I don't know what we had other than plain films and upper GIs and barium enemas. Upper GIs and barium enemas have been replaced by colonoscopies and EGDs and what have you. So you wonder how we got by. We didn't even have ultrasound. I can remember when Claude Joyner, cardiologist here, was walking through the place, you know, trying to find people to test out his new ultrasound machine back in, you know, when we were medical students. So to think that all of that has come along. And there was one other thing that we did have, and that was on the 8th floor of the Gates Pavilion. There was a man named Isaac Starr, and he had the ballistocardiogram. Okay, now that never made it to prime time, but if you Google it, it looks like it may be coming back. So, you know, Dr. Starr would be obviously very pleased. So if you look at this kind of thing as our legacy, I'd say we did pretty good in 50 years. Not only, I mean, we had the founders of some of these things, the inventors of some of these things, but we also disseminated the information so that everybody had it and everybody could use it. So I think that we deserve a pat on the back, at least for our generation, for having brought these things along. But if that's the case, why is the delivery of medical care right up there politically in terms of problems that this country has? A lot of it is the cost, okay? If you look at the cost, U.S. healthcare, you know, has grown 3.9% in 2017. It's up to $3.5 trillion, about a third of which is covered by the government. Spending continues to go up, and it'll probably be recorded as being up in 2018. So people are upset about that. Now, here's a quote. All hospitals are accountable to the public for their degree of success. If the initiative is not taken by the medical profession, it will be taken by the lay public. It should be down there, but it's not. American College of Surgery, there you go. Doesn't have when it was done, but anyway, this was published in 1918, okay? I stole this slide from David Nash, who's at Jefferson, and if R.G. Williams heard me say that, you know, he would probably have had a conniption that we attributed something to Jefferson. But anyway, so what have we done, okay, over the course of the past 50 years in an effort to try to make things better as far as the public is concerned in the delivery of medical care? Why this isn't working and where our guy is, I have no idea. Yeah, I'm hitting the middle button. Okay. Now I'll go back. And that's what I'm on. Okay. I hate to, now over the course of this, I may mention Duke a little bit, and I don't mean to talk about that. I'm here to talk more about Penn and what's been accomplished at Penn. But then again, there is a little bit of a relationship at Duke. You'll recall when we came here, Jim Weingarten was the chief of medicine for 2 years before he left to go back to Duke. Several years later, one of the people that was in his lab, a guy named Bill Kelly, who was in Jim Weingarten's lab at Duke, went to Michigan, and then he came here as, I guess the title was the chief medical officer, and he's responsible, at least in part, for some of the development that occurred here. He brought on another young fellow that was in his lab, Ed Holmes, who was the chief of medicine here for a number of years. He was a Penn graduate as well, played the dirty old man Santa Claus at the New Sig Christmas party. Anyway, at Duke, in the early 1960s, the chief of medicine there, Gene Stead, got the idea of having physician's assistants. Truth be told, this was not supposed to be physician's assistants, it was supposed to be nurse practitioners. He went to the head of the dean of the School of Nursing at Duke, who thought that it was a ridiculous idea, and that the nursing school wanted nothing to do with it, so Gene Stead went out and got what he felt was the next best thing, and it was corpsmen from the military to start this project going. Now, there are PA schools all over, and PAs certainly represent a significant part of what's going on in the delivery of medical care. And I would say that's a great thing as long as they're supervised. Here we go. Now, what have been the changing roles of physicians here? We just wanted to get our exercise. I don't know if this is running weak on batteries or what, but.
Hey, Joe, where are you?
Okay. Primary care physicians, at least we've changed the initials. It used to be LMD, now it's PCP. But primary care physicians, in today's day and age, aren't even seeing their patients in the hospital, at least in most institutions. What they do is they see outpatients, and that has a lot to do, not necessarily with them, but for the structures within they work. We divided patients into body parts, okay? We have, maybe a PCP, but somebody has their neurologist, their nephrologist, their rheumatologist, their this, their that. Is that really good delivery of medical care? We have hospitalists, people that follow patients just in the hospital, but nonetheless don't have anything to do with them as outpatients. Is that really good? How do patients perceive this? Well, we have patient sharing. So let's say you have an oncologist and you're dealing with cancer and you're admitted to the hospital and they consult oncology. So an oncologist comes around and the patient says, you're not my doctor. Where's Dr. So-and-so? Well, he's not on service, okay? So now you're dealing, with a number of people that really don't have a relationship with the patient and trying to deliver care. Okay. So what are the unintended consequences of all this? Okay. Number one, we have high admission rates, readmission rates. Number two, we have poor transitions of care. And these are all issues that are really coming up. There's been a greater increase in the expense of medicine. What's been the impact on patients? Okay, you'll recall this was published, I think, in about 1999 to Errors Human. We're being attributed killing 100,000 patients a year. Is that because of the way things are structured, or are we bad doctors? Well, I don't think we're bad doctors, but I'm concerned about the structure. Okay, so anyway, what's the issue with all this? You recall from Cool Hand Luke, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And I think that that's one of the issues that was brought up into Errors Human, that these are system errors that are occurring. And what we've done is create an environment in which system errors are very easy to occur. Now, what are the influences? Well, money and medical education is a big one. Government, private health insurance, computers, and the organization of medical practices that I've alluded to. Medical education, the cost. Let's reflect back to when most of us are the older guard. When we went to medical school, when I applied, $1,050 a year was tuition. By the time we got out, well, when we showed up, it was $1,250. By the time we got out, it was $2,450. Our entire tuition for medical school, $7,000. I tell people that I have grandsons that went to nursery school in Boston 3 half days a week, $7,000. Okay. So, the cost of medical education has been a dramatic change. What's been the impact of that cost? Okay. Does that impact the choice of career that medical students have? Does it impact the choice of employment? People get out with this kind of debt from medical school, they need a job. They need somebody to write a check. You can't go to a bank and say, when was the last time anybody here saw somebody come into their community and hang up a shingle? Well, they don't do that anymore. They open a website, or they put up a website. But anyway, people don't do that. They're looking for jobs with health systems. That makes everybody kind of congregate, the physician graduates these days congregate around where there are hospitals and there are health systems, and it has a negative impact, in my opinion, on medical care. You'll recall when we were in school, another impact that comes. When we were in school, the Harrison's textbook of internal medicine, he who knows medicine, or he who knows Harrison knows medicine. okay? And if you're looking at government regulations, Harrison's is a textbook of about 4,000 pages. Government regulations is well over 100,000 patients. Now, anybody that goes into practice is subject to those rules. Now, granted, some for hospitals and nursing homes and what have you, but that's where we work. So we have to be familiar. Does a guy want to really go out and take on that responsibility? So I think that has a lot to do with how people choose their practices. We have DRGs that are there. If you recall how this came along, this was supposed to be the first cost sharing. You know, DRGs, they were going to, if you came in with pneumonia, the government would give you $5,000, you know, to take care of the pneumonia. If they got out of the hospital a little sooner, you pocketed the extra money as a practitioner or as a hospital. If they stayed longer, you were out of luck, and you had to cover it. But with these changing rules, now we have admission versus observation. You know, we have admissions being defined by the length of stay. In the government, the 2 midnight rule. So if you're going to come in the hospital, you have to be there for 2 midnights. Otherwise, you're deemed in an observation status, not an admission status. Doesn't go over with patients. Each one of these new mandates is a new form that physicians have to deal with. And no wonder primary care physicians don't want to come to hospitals. This, you know, all the cheap, lousy ways to save a buck came from Helen Shirley, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. But I think that that's one of the ways that patients are actually looking at this. Private health insurance, they more or less do the same thing. They have cost containment by denial. You know, I have a woman that has 2 malignancies, okay, now has new complaints of lower extremity edema, new nodules all over her, and I tried to get a PET scan, and it's still pending, okay, to see whether or not she's got a recurrence of her malignancy. Cost containment by pre-authorization. Those of you who still work, you know how aggravating it is to try to schedule a test or an admission for surgery or what have you, and you have to wait for the pre-authorization from the insurance companies. Observation versus admission. How does all this play with patients? Patients don't like it. You know, patients come into the hospital and you have to do a peer-to-peer, you know, for their admission requirement to see if they deserve to be in the hospital, and that becomes a major issue for the patient. So if they get denied, they may or may not have some type of responsibility for the bill that they get. Computers in medicine. Now, we all regard that as something that's probably significant, but at least let's stick with the EHR. We now have scribes. We have physicians that are now data enterers into the computer system. So in an effort to try to make it more efficient, they have scribes. So now we have another person that's actually writing a note. They're not taking dictation. They're actually putting the note together. We have computer-generated notes. Anything that happens gets thrown into this note. The notes become extremely long. You know, the notes are long, and we also have cut and paste. You know, cut and paste is the biggest aggravation. As a guy that does utilization review for our hospital, it's the biggest damn problem that we have. I tried to get it outlawed in our hospital, but to no avail. So, whoops. You know, when it comes to the notes and you try to go through progress notes, where's the beef? You know, it's tough to find. And this is how we feel about the computer, you know, in our office. What are the unintended consequences of computers? It has is it really HIPAA compliant? Is it really, effective with regard to portability of care? Is it lead to efficient care with regard to medicine and efficient utilization of physicians' time? And how do the patients think about it? And again, I think it turns out to be one more aggravation for the patients as they try to weave through. Rather than sitting down and getting answers from your doctor, they're told, go to the website and you can take a look at your laboratory work. As I think about medicine and my career in medicine, I kind of look back to the days that were actually even going to be a little bit prior to when we came to medical school. And this was done by Norman Rockwell, and it's called A Visit to a Country Doctor, and it was supposed to have been done in about 1947. I assume it was done in 1947. I'm showing this predominantly, to point out something in contrast to where we are today. So you can see here's the kindly old doctor. Here, I don't know if this is the patient or this is the patient, but anyway, the doctor's looking the patient in the eye. The husband is attentive, he's listening. Over here, I presume is a sibling. I don't know if that's the doctor's dog or if it's the patient's dog, okay? Now, you might say that that this is terrible, that you have a dog in the room with the patient who's going to be breeding germs. I would point out a recent article that was, I think, in a Swedish medical journal that says there are more pathogens in a person's beard than there are in the nape of a dog's neck, okay? So anyway, I don't berate the dog. Nonetheless, this is kind of a picture of medicine in a year gone by. This one, whoops, here I go again. This one is a picture that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think in about 2012. And if somehow this works. But anyway, let me go back, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, the patient is sitting on the examining table. I assume that that's her mother next to her and a sibling holding either a baby doll or a young child over in the corner. And there's the doctor, okay? Man, okay. Yeah. The mouse, okay.
Actually, if you
Okay,
look at the computer, yeah.
here's the doctor looking at a computer, okay? If I could tell you one complaint that I hear from patients when they come into the office, if they've seen other doctors, I refuse to take a computer into the room with me because it's too tempting to start looking at a computer. So when I go into a room and I start talking to the patient and I'm looking to them, first thing that they say to me is, you're not looking at a computer, you're different, okay? And I think that to a great extent, that's what patients want, a little bit of personalization. In my career in medicine, I have been exposed to three wise men, okay? I would say the first wise man is Gene Stead, who was the chief of medicine, former chief of medicine at Duke, actually before I got there. Jim Weingarten replaced him. But Dr. Stead would round with the students and residents, talk to patients, and then we'd go into a conference room and he would talk about the patient's problems and what have you. And he would dictate a note at the end. Dr. Stead did not write a note as most of the rounding guys did. He dictated a note to the resident who would write it. And he would tell the resident to get ready by saying, "Save for me," okay? So it was, his one comment that came very often was, "Say for me what this patient needs as a doctor." Now, some of the students would be aghast at this, that, oh my God, I didn't get the right history, I didn't do the right physical exam, I didn't order the right test, what have you. That's not what he meant at all. What he meant was the patient had a significant problem with stress. Either it was an emotional problem that brought them in, or they were having trouble dealing with their illness, and they needed somebody to sit down with them, okay, look them in the eye, and talk to them about the problem. So that's what Dr. Stead meant. We didn't have to go to Duke to get that. This is Francis Wood, okay? Francis Wood used to have a session with us as students, okay? And he would talk about what it's like to be a doctor. And one thing he said that I would always remember, and that is, when you want to go into a room of a patient, sit down with them, sit down, because that's going to make them feel so much more comfortable, like they can have a conversation with a doctor and get more. He said you may spend the same amount of time in the room sitting down as you will standing up, but the patient will get so much more out of it. And that's one thing that I remembered, and someday when I'm having a bad day and I'm about ready to go into somebody else's room, I just take a breath and I say, okay, JD, you're having a bad day. It's not this person's fault, at least not yet, okay? Just go in and do your thing. Which is what I've always tried to do. So I've remembered Francis Wood, and I've remembered Gene Stead. Another guy that I remember, if you're from State College, everybody knows Joe Paterno, everybody's heard of Joe Paterno. And when we talked about Joe, or when I asked Joe Paterno once about how he dealt with so many people or so many players and families that came there expecting to be the next NFL player, and he realized that they weren't good and they weren't even going to start at Penn State, let alone make it to the NFL. He said, how do you do that? How do you deal with them? And he said, it's not enough to be fair, you have to appear fair. So I've taken Joe Paterno, gone back to Gene Stead, gone back to Francis Wood, and change that, at least in my impression about medicine. It's not enough to be concerned about patients. You have to appear concerned. When I walked in, I was taken by something on the wall just as we came around the corner. It was a quote from Sir William Osler, who said the same thing. He said, "A good doctor can treat a disease. A great doctor treats the patient with the disease." So I guess if we did all this wonderful stuff in the past 50 years, what's our legacy been now? What's the legacy now of medicine and the people that practice it and the people that administer it? Do we get the same high grades, or do they get the same high grades as we can get for saying that these are all the wonderful scientific things that we've achieved? And unfortunately, I'm not so sure that we do. This is Paul Muni, when he was in a picture called The Last Angry Man. And sometimes when I argue these things, I think I'm the last angry man. I recommend this to you, this movie to you. It's an oldie, it's in black and white, which may turn some people off. But anyway, it's really about a primary care physician that was practicing in New York and was really bothered by a lot of attention he was getting from the media and what have you, because they wanted to make him a hero, and all he wanted to do was take care of this one patient that he had who was a young African-American man with a seizure disorder. He wanted to take care of him, and he wanted all this distraction to get out of the way. I think we have a lot of distractions in medicine. I wish they would all go away. I'm not sure they're going to go away, and they may get worse. But I think we're going to have to figure out something to do. I sit here maybe with a lot of other last angry men as well. So that's my spiel.
John, that was great. I feel like we went to the same medical school. I remember a lot of those things. In fact, my wife may agree with me that country doctor on the Rockwell painting, I think it was my dad. Anyway, John, thank you for that spectacular presentation. I understand I'm one of the other last angry men. And now you know why I want him to be the presenter at the Oscars. Thanks again. Our next presenter is Patty Aquaviva Gabao. Patty was one of 5 women in our class of 120 plus. Now that's a number that to the current, yes, that's the point. I mean, so she was clearly very special. And when you tell people of this day and age that we had 5 women in a class of 125, they are absolutely flabbergasted. Happily, this is no longer the case. She was clearly a star, but I have to make a confession. Until I saw your CV, I thought you had gone to Seton Hall. Patty became pretty famous out in Denver for revolutionizing their entire healthcare system, doing some very innovative things. She's widely celebrated. You see here that at one point, she was named one of the 100 most popular people in healthcare in the United States. Powerful. Yeah, I'm sure that's not, but that's, yeah. And then graduated to the top 50. And as far as Dan and I are concerned, she's in the top 3 or 4. But I'm really thrilled to introduce her today. She's going to speak to us about real current topics, and maybe she'll run for president also, because anyone who can answer these questions ought to be on the docket. Patty?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I begin, let me explain my voice. I have spastic dysphonia. Treatment for is Botox for the women, does nothing for my wrinkles. When I first get it, I sound very breathy like Marilyn Monroe. And when I need it, I sound like I do now. So I apologize that you're not getting a Maryland version of this talk. When we talk about the evolution of the healthcare system, there are 4 domains we need to talk about: cost, coverage and access, outcomes, equity, and disparity. And I'm going to spend most of my time on cost and outcomes. There are 3 points to make about the evolution of healthcare. It's the big gorilla in this country. We now understand that healthcare does not equal health, and these two have a major implication. When we were graduating, 3% of the workforce was in healthcare. Now it's 18%. 32% of all new jobs in the decade following 2007 were in healthcare. Healthcare is now the single biggest employer in the United States, and it will continue to be. 4 of the 6 predicted fastest growing jobs in a decade after 2016 will be in healthcare. So it has become an important part of the economy. And in fact, I just saw an article in the New York Times today saying that you can't do Medicare for all because too many people in the insurance industry, et cetera, would lose their jobs. Now, not only is it a big employer, it's a huge expense. This shows national healthcare expenditure, and if you look back to where we graduated, you can hardly see it on this chart, and it has risen dramatically over the ensuing decades. And as you heard from John, it's now over $3.4 trillion. Now, in addition to growing and being so expensive, it has grown more than it has grown in other high-income countries. If you look back at when we graduated, the other high-income countries were spending about 5% of their GDP on healthcare, and we were a little bit above 6%, so not very much different. Over time, they slipped up a little bit, but we went up remarkably. So the gap between other countries and us has grown, and we are now at 18% of our GDP. And it's not just because we're big. If you look at the per capita cost, in the United States, it costs over $10,000 a person. In the rest of the developed countries, the average is about $5,000. And who's getting all this money? Well, virtually everybody is getting a piece of the pie. But the 2 biggest pieces are hospitals and physicians and clinics. Now, when people look at this, they ask the obvious question: why does American healthcare cost so much? And the famous Princeton economist, Uwe Reinhardt, looked at the data and said, it's the prices, stupid. And very recently, one of his colleagues re-examined this question and said, it's still the prices, stupid. And we pay more for people, products, and procedures in the US than in other developed countries. So our physicians, all of us, whether you're a PCP or a specialist, make considerably more in the United States than other developed countries. And this is true even if you correct for medical debt. Nurses also make more. And a number of years ago, one of the British newspapers thought they were breaking a big scandal by saying that the highest paid hospital administrator in the UK made over 400,000 American dollars. Now, just recently, Becker's reported that 5 US healthcare system administrators, and these weren't pharma CEOs, these were health system administrators, made between 10 and 17 million, and 17 earned more than 5 million. And you can bet that every one of them earned more than that guy in the UK. Pharmaceuticals have got a lot of attention, and we pay twice as much per capita for drugs as other high-income countries. More for devices, and procedures are more expensive. And to give a couple examples, you can get a month's supply of Humira in Switzerland for about $800. But in the United States, it's about 2,700. So it pays to get a flight to Europe and fill up your suitcase. Insulin costs 10 times in the United States what it does in Canada, and that's a high-end drug. If you need a knee replacement, as I did, you should go to Australia, where you can get one for about $16,000. The average cost in the United States is about $28,000, but in some cities, you will pay more than $60,000 for a knee replacement. So it's not just the price, it's the variability in price, even within the same region or city. Now, John alluded to some of this. This is what's happened to the administrative costs since we graduated. When we graduated, you couldn't even see what that number was. And now it has gone up dramatically. We're now spending 8% of all our healthcare expenditures on administration. Other high-income countries are spending 3%. And it's 8% of a much bigger number. Now, Bloomberg looked at this data and said America ranks 50th out of 55 countries in efficiency in our healthcare system. We were right next to Russia. A number of years ago, the IOM did a study and concluded that 30 to 40% of all healthcare costs are waste. And at that time, it was over $700 billion. Now, it's over $1 trillion in waste. That's just being thrown out the window. It's not buying one jot of well-being for anybody. And I want you to remember that $1 trillion, because I'm going to come back to it at the end. And this is due to the myriad of delivery and payment models, and also as much as 30% of the healthcare Americans do receive is not valuable or even harmful. And that's what we, as physicians, write with our pencils or now type into the computer. MedPAC recently released a study that 37% of Medicare beneficiaries received at least one low-value service. 72 low-value services per 100 beneficiaries. Medicare alone in 2014 spent $6.5 billion on low-value care that could have been better utilized in our society. So we have big issues in these domains, and even with our huge cost, we're the only developed country that doesn't cover everyone. And we have major disparity and inequities across gender, race, and geography. And we have issues with quality that John alluded to. Now, to point out the geographic disparity, this is a picture of Washington, D.C., and within a few miles, there's a 27-year difference in life expectancy. And the data looks like this for every city that has been studied. And there's the same huge geographic discrepancy in life expectancy in counties, within states, and within states. If you live in Alabama, you should wish you lived in Hawaii, for a lot of reasons. Now here's a little quiz for all of you. So in your mind, I want you to draw what this graph looks like. Where do we in the United States rank in life expectancy out of the 17 high-income countries? Number one is the best. Where do we rank at age 5, age 20, age 50, et cetera? So think about that. Now, you'd think with everything that we spend, we should be 1 or 2 across the entire spectrum. But actually, here's what we look like. We never get above 15 until age 75, and we hit number 1 when we're 95, when most of us in this room will be dead. Now, the reason they use life expectancy as a measure of quality is because most of us want to live a long life, and it's an unambiguous endpoint, so the data is pretty good. But you might also look at it this way. What amount of life expectancy do we get for the money we spend? Well, for most countries, if you spend a little more, you get a bump in life expectancy, but not us. We are a major outlier. Now, many of you would say, well, life expectancy is important, but it's not the only measure of quality. And that's true. And the Commonwealth looked at 5 domains: care processes, access, administration, efficiency, equity, and health outcomes. And they developed an overall index. And compared to the other high-income countries, we were at the bottom. Now, the National Academy of Medicine looked at all this data and said what we should be saying: why, despite higher expenditure than almost any other country, have we achieved less health? And 400 pages later, they concluded that a major reason lies in the fact that the foci of our attention, our resources, our incentives are too narrow. Our investments are primarily directed to a biomedical focus. Well, what does that mean? Well, here are the determinants of health. And we focus on the healthcare system, which only predicts or guarantees 10 to 15% of health and well-being. These other variables have the most important effect, and of those, income is probably the most important. There's a linear relationship between life expectancy and income. Now, so if you look at the other dimensions of health, this slide shows the total expenditure on social care and health care for the developed countries. 11 countries spend more in total than we do. But no country, let me underscore that, no country spends more on health care than social care, which is where you get all the good outcomes. Not only do we spend less, but we've been squeezing that. This is data from Don Berwick from Massachusetts, looking at the period of Massachusetts expenditure from 2002 to 2012. Everything went down except healthcare, which went up. So what do we need to do? Well, remember that $1 trillion of waste that isn't buying any health? We have to take that $1 trillion in waste out of the healthcare system in a smart way. That doesn't mean cutting people off of Medicaid or things of that nature, and we need to redistribute it to the other factors that have a bigger influence on health and well-being. Now, I was in healthcare for a long time at a safety net, and what I learned very quickly is when you try to take any money, let alone $1 trillion from somebody, this is what you meet. And in fact, the healthcare industry last year spent $550 billion in lobbying to make sure this guy continued to look like this. But we cannot continue with this if we want to have a healthy population, which is our future. And I would just say there's hope, because even the meanest, toughest gorilla can be tamed. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. That's probably the largest collection of bad news I've ever heard at any one time, but it was a spectacular presentation. And I will admit that when she threw up the map of the Washington, D.C. area, I immediately looked, as did my family, and noticed that we seem to be living in the right place with the highest longest life expectancy. So we're not moving. Our final presenter is Bill Thompson, who's, as I've already told you, famous for having been born here at HUP and as my roommate. And turns out Bill's dad and my dad were actually classmates at Penn Med School in the class of 1940. So we have a long, otherwise unknown relationship prior to when we got here. Bill has been a pillar of the academic radiology community for many, many years. Been chair at both Duke and at University of Minnesota, has run spectacularly successful and well thought of training programs in all these places, and maybe alone amongst all of us is still fully practicing. I don't know how many of the rest of us are still doing that, but it ain't many. So it's a pleasure to welcome him to tell us a little bit about what's happening in the evolution of diagnostic imaging, which I'm sure is going to be fascinating. Bill.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank my panelists for taking all the time. I think I have 2 minutes to give my talk. But that's okay, because I've been known to show 95 slides in 15 minutes. I can make this as long or as short as you'd like it to be. And the good news is, I think it's only about 10 minutes, so we'll see. Now, I was asked to give this topic by Courtney. And by the way, before I go any farther, I want to thank Courtney. I'm not sure if she's here, but if she is, let's give her a round of applause. Courtney and Lauren, I mean, we wouldn't be here without them. And our committee worked diligently to put on this whole program, and I just feel delighted to be here. I also would like to thank my colleagues at the University of New Mexico who gave me many of these ideas. Now, I decided I was going to talk about 50 years of radiology, past, present, and future, and interestingly enough, this is my 50th year in radiology. I started the day I left medical school. I did a radiology internship at Case Western Reserve, and then I became a radiologist by act of Congress at the Alaska Native Medical Center for 2 years before I did my residency, and then I did my residency. So we are going to take you, so what's happened in the past 50 years? And we're going to take you through old-time radiology. That's the way radiology, I'm sure many in this room thought about the radiologists. I don't think they told my dad that, but that's what, that's what they thought about. And basically, here's what's happened in radiology. We are now out in the middle of every single patient decision, every bit of patient care. We work in diagnosis, treatment, work with the patient, work with the doctors, and basically we really are gross pathologists. Now we're becoming more microscopic pathologists based on some of the imaging technology that I will show you. Now, for those of you who have not seen this, don't look at this picture, because we're going to come back to it at the end and make a point. Those of you who have seen it, don't say anything to your neighbor, okay? Because I have an interesting piece of information for you about this photograph. And now what's happened in radiology? We used to be outside the body. Now we're inside the body. We're looking into the abdomen. We're looking into the chest. So we're going to talk about comparing radiology over the past 50 years. We're going to talk about the multiple radiology subsections. I'll give you 4 case examples. Unfortunately, I can't give you something from every single aspect of radiology because of limited time. I'll talk about how the workday has changed. And most of you don't have any idea what's happened in terms of our workday, but it's absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to talk about, give you the names of the professors that had a major influence on me here at Penn. And then I'll give you some take-home points at the end. So what's been the major driver? Well, one of the major drivers in all of medicine, as a couple of our panelists talked about, is minimally invasive therapies, doing the least amount of the patient for the most amount of good. Laparoscopic techniques in the abdomen have revolutionized the whole technology. In fact, not to get too personal, but one of the things I wanted to do was talk about acute cholecystitis. And I wanted to take a photograph of my wife's scar from 50 years ago versus her daughter's scar from about 5 years ago, and you wouldn't believe the difference, but she wouldn't let me do that, so I couldn't do that. So radiology has driven this effort because of the precise diagnoses and outlying anatomy, and the treating physician and radiologist can do amazing things now that we had no concept of when I was a medical student. And things are going to continue to improve. Thank God for all of us, because I suspect someone in this room, by our next time we get together, will have had some kind of surgery, and it'll be minimally invasive. I know I'm going to have knee surgery before too long, and I hope they do a good job. So what do we have 50 years ago? Plain films, we already alluded to that, of the total body. We had GI studies, and we had GU studies, and we basically had interventional radiology, angiography just getting started, and we had nuclear medicine. And that's all we had. And none of these were really 3D techniques. What do we have now? Everything is 3D, cross-sectional imaging. Ultrasound, CT, MR, PET-CT, and MR PET have just revolutionized our ability to take care of patients. Interventional radiology and interventional neuroradiology are doing stuff that you just can't imagine what's happening. Radiology has changed the practice of medicine more than anything else in all of medicine. So just think about that. Think about how in the blazes do we take care of patients 50 years ago compared to now. It's just absolutely incredible to me. How and why did this happen? Well, first, we have direct imaging. We can visualize the entire body from the inside, both on a gross pathology level and a microscopic level. It's absolutely incredible. We can look inside the skull. We used to diagnose a subdural hematoma by seeing if there was a shift in the pineal. How sensitive is that? Not at all. So it's amazing what's happened in the spine, in the joints, in the chest, in the abdomen and pelvis. These are the subsections we have now in radiology. When my dad was a radiologist, my dad was trained here at PGH and went to Albuquerque in 1946 and did 50 years of radiology. He was a general type radiologist. Nowadays, even the private practice groups basically are divided up into multiple sections. So we have major experts at each one of these areas, at each one of these diseases. And it's just incredible what's happened. We have 3D anatomy, head to toe, direct minimally invasive therapies, which is incredible what we're doing now. Detect and stage malignancies. We can look at physiology using our technology in real time, biomarkers of disease to tell us whether we're doing good or bad in terms of patient care, and then we can change things much faster than ever before. Molecular imaging is incredible what's going on there, and that's going to direct molecular therapy. Before some of you in the audience, not us probably, but in 15, 20 years, we will have true directed metabolic therapies going right to the cell to basically destroy what's going on and not do any harm. It's absolutely incredible. And then artificial intelligence, it will not replace the radiologist, even though that was a big theme, okay? But it will do a lot to improve what we're doing and make things much, much better for all of us as patients. I'm going to give you 4 quick examples here of acute appendicitis, stroke, tumor detection, and then knee surgery. Now, question for you. How many of you have had either a relative or yourself have an acute appendicitis? Not a fair number. So I picked this because I thought everybody would understand that. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a stone obstructing the appendix and then basically producing a markedly abnormal, terrible, necrotic appendix that needs to come out. So what happened before? When we were medical students, what did we do? It was a clinical diagnosis. We made the diagnosis about 80% of the time. False positive surgery. Think about this. 25% of the time, the surgeon went in, he's nodding his head, and took the abnormal appendix out. If you didn't do that, you got chastised. You were not taking out enough normal appendices. That's great. If we did that today, you'd lose your hospital privileges. You wouldn't be able to practice. And that was the standard of care. The worst part about it is up to 8% wound infection in normal surgery, normal appendectomies. And those patients ended up being in the hospital a long time. So what's changed? Well, I should mention radiographic signs. We made the diagnosis radiographically in less than 10% of the patients. Not very, very helpful. We were looking for a calcification in the region of the appendix, which we can see here on this film. We were looking for gas in the appendix. We were looking for free air. We were looking for abnormal cecal free air and small bowel obstruction. Those were the kind of plain film findings. Not very good. What's happened? It's just incredible what's happened. History and physical stayed the same. The disease is still the same. But now what's happened? We can basically make the diagnosis almost 100% of the time using multiple imaging technologies, as I'll show you. It's just absolutely incredible. So the correct diagnosis is made almost 100% of the time versus 80%. Laparoscopic appendectomy, somebody already talked about. These patients come in the hospital and they're out in a day or two versus a week or two. It's just incredible what's happened. Huge saving in time, huge saving in money, Patty. I mean, this is really amazing what we've been able to do in terms of directing therapy. Here's an example from our hospital. On your left, you see the yellow arrow marking the appendicolith, and then 4 MR images, 2 axial and 2 coronal images. The yellow arrow marks the signal void of the stone in the appendix, and the green arrow marks the inflamed appendix. This patient was out of the hospital in a day or two. Another example, ultrasound showing you an abnormal appendix. We do this primarily in kids and pregnant women to basically make the diagnosis of acute appendicitis, and they go straight to surgery. If we can't decide what was going on an ultrasound, then we can always do a CT. And in this case, we could see an appendicolith as well as a periappendiceal abscess in this young child. And they were treated appropriately. So this is an amazing advance in terms of appendicitis. Just one example in the abdomen. I could give you 50 more. What's happened in stroke? I mean, this is incredible. 1969, we knew what stroke was due to. The problem is we had no way really to diagnose it, except I'll show you, which was arteriography. CT didn't come along until after we graduated from medical school. And so conventional angiography was the mainstay of the diagnosis. But here's a quote from the New England Journal of Medicine: we were killing 1 out of every 100 patients with this technology, and basically they had a normal study. That's totally changed now. What's amazing in stroke is all patients with stroke symptoms receive standardized one-stop imaging with non-contrast head CT and then a CTA to confirm the presence of large vessel occlusion. Absolutely incredible. Most patients with large vessel occlusion, if we can get them into a hospital before 6 hours, can undergo a thrombectomy, as I'll show you. Here's a Venn diagram showing you what happens to a patient with stroke and how quickly and fast we can get these patients taken care of and treated. It's absolutely incredible. And I'll show you a case here. This was an elderly gentleman. On your left, you see a normal CT. On your right, you see 2 yellow arrows, one pointing to no blood supply in his right hemisphere and one pointing to normal blood supply on the left. Here's the arteriogram that shows you the blood clot. No circulation in that part of the brain. Here's the arteriogram after the thrombectomy showing you that it's been removed, and basically here are the blood vessels in the brain that have been restored to circulation. Absolutely incredible, incredible. No chance of doing this 50 years ago. What's happened in nuclear medicine? Truly amazing. We went from slow spectral linear scanners to almost instantaneous imaging now, but the huge advancement has been in targeted isotopes for tumor detection, which is absolutely incredible. Here's an MR in a patient that's showing you a tiny little disease, a focus of disease, in a patient with a neuroendocrine tumor of the pancreas. This new isotope is only 2 years old. What's it allow us to do? To detect that little teeny tiny metastasis right there in the liver. His CT's perfectly normal. We'd have missed it completely. This patient had that resected and probably has a normal lifespan because of it. Absolutely incredible what's going on in terms of tumor detection and therapy. Musculoskeletal, near and dear to my heart and Dr. Anderson's heart. He understands about this very well. 3D imaging, joints, knee, hips, arthroscopic techniques, tumor staging, normal looking knee, perfectly normal. Do an MR, torn ACL on your left, on your right, with a normal on your left. Arthroscopic surgery, patient back, running again within 6 months. Absolutely incredible. No, before in the old days, they would split this person's thigh from stem to turn over the top of the kneecap and fix that. It's unbelievable what's happened. Now, workflow, what's happened here? In the old days, many of you remember this, we had view boxes and multi-viewers. We had a dictaphone, we dictated into it, the reports are typed, and maybe they came back 7 to 10 days later, we got them to the clinicians. I mean, absolutely awful. In fact, I remember in my training, we would get 30 or 40 unread films from a patient in the ICU. The damn clinicians had stolen all the films. The guy had died. They finally gave us the films, we read them. Did they mean anything? No, meant nothing. How we got paid, I have no idea, but we did. That's all changed, thank God. So what's happened now? Images displayed on monitors within minutes of acquiring. In fact, it kind of hacks me off. Sometimes the clinicians will see the damn images before I've even had a chance to look at them, and they'll call me up to ask me what the hell's going on. I say, wait a minute, I haven't seen them. Well, I have. That's good and bad. Voice-activated dictation system. Incredible what's happened. Physicians are not getting these reports. As soon as I dictate it and push the button, in 4 to 24 hours, they get routine studies, and within minutes, they get emergent studies. I mean, absolutely unbelievably incredible. Artificial intelligence is going to speed up this whole process, and it's going to make us even better, faster, and more efficient, and hopefully cheaper. Old view box on your left, multi-viewer on your right, okay? What do we do now? Basically have that. And what can you do? You can dictate, just like I was doing last week when I had this picture taken. And I mean, it's amazing what we're able to do. So just for a moment, I want to reflect on, these are the gentlemen who had a huge impact on my career. And many of you will remember these people. I spent most of my time in my senior year at CHOP doing research and pediatric cardiovascular surgery, and that's where I thought I was going and decided to go into radiology. John Walthouse and Bill Pearson and William Raskin were just incredible, wonderful mentors to me. I got a chance to do anesthesia for C. Everett Koop, and Bachman and Downs, the pediatric anesthesiologists, were just wonderful in my career, and Clyde Barker was my advisor. Wally Miller. How many of you remember Wally Miller? Yeah, everybody does. Why? Because every day you came down to find out what the hell was going on with your patient. He was absolutely amazing, amazing guy. And unfortunately, we've lost all that because of our computer-based stuff, as Dan alluded to. Bob Campbell, a radiologist down at, yes, sir. Oh, you know Bob Campbell, yeah. Bob Campbell, radiologist down at Pennsylvania Hospital. He's getting an endowed chair here at the University of Pennsylvania, which is absolutely well-deserved. So these people had amazing influence on my life and my profession. And so did these people. These people really did. how a black guy from Philadelphia, a Jewish guy from upper Pennsylvania, and a waspy white guy from out in the West got together. I have no idea, but we've been lifelong friends, and it has been absolutely wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the two guys down below were all American basketball players that most of us couldn't keep up with, and they had a major influence on my life. The end is near. Okay, how many people see an old woman? How many people see a young woman? Yeah. Okay. The people that see the old woman are pessimists, and the people that see the young woman are optimists. With that, I just want to let you know that radiology has changed my life and changed all of your lives and will continue to do that. And I personally feel it's changed medicine more than anything else in medicine. Cross-sectional imaging, head to toe, looking inside the body. Targeted isotopes for diagnosis and therapy is going to revolutionize medicine along the lines of what Dan talked about. Biomarkers for monitoring therapies. We haven't even started doing that. Molecular imaging is going to be amazing in terms of targeted therapies, and we're going to improve our minimally invasive therapies, huge saving in times and money, and markedly improve patient care. Thank you all very much.
Well done.
Thank you.
Sort of the good cop, bad cop follow-up, wasn't it? Do we have time for questions? No, we don't. All right. I had that feeling. Well, in that case, let me wrap this up. I want to thank everyone for coming here. This has been absolutely spectacular for me. I learned a lot, and I hope that this turns into a spectacular medical alumni weekend for all of you. I know we have a lot of exciting events coming up in the next 48 hours, and I hope to see most of you at those. So thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.